Before we get into tonight's story, a huge thank you to Don Welsh for suggesting this one. Don, this was a brilliant idea and we could not have picked a better topic for a night like this. If you have a story you want us to investigate, drop it in the comments. This community has some of the best instincts for finding the ones that matter. And speaking of this community, before we begin, tell us where in the world you are right now. Drop your location and your local time in the comments below. We genuinely love seeing it. People tuning in from opposite ends of the planet, in the middle of the night, in the early hours of the morning, on their lunch break halfway across the world. The fact that this community stretches as far as it does means everything to us. Now let's get into it. Get comfortable. Settle in. Turn the lights down, if you have them on at all. Tonight's story begins with a single sentence. A sentence recovered from a classified document in the basement of a Paraguayan police facility in December of 1992. The document was water-stained, partially illegible, and buried beneath hundreds of thousands of other pages that the world had never been meant to see. But one phrase survived, stamped in bureaucratic ink in the clean, cold language of intelligence protocol. It read, "Phase operational continuity, pending." No date, no signature, no explanation attached. The man who found it stared at it for a long time. He had been expecting to find records of the dead, names, locations, methods. He had been expecting to find the evidence that would close the book on one of the most brutal intelligence operations in modern Western Hemisphere history. Instead, he found 4 words that did something far more unsettling than confirm what everyone already suspected. They suggested that it wasn't over. My name doesn't matter. What matters is this. Over the next several hours, I'm going to walk you through a story that begins in Santiago, Chile, in the autumn of 1975, and ends, if it ends at all, in the present day. This is the story of Operation Condor, but more specifically, this is the story of what Operation Condor became after the history books said it was finished. Stay with me. Section 1. The Documented Program, November 25th, 1975. Santiago, Chile. The air in Santiago in November carried the particular weight of a city still in shock. It had been just over 2 years since the military coup of September 11th, 1973. The day that General Augusto Pinochet's forces bombed the presidential palace, overthrew the democratically elected Salvador Allende, and seized control of one of South America's most politically active nations. 2 years of disappearances. 2 years of the Estadio Nacional being used as a detention centre. 2 years of the systematic elimination of anyone considered a threat to the new regime, and now, on this November morning, in a building that did not officially exist for the purpose it was being used, something new was being formalised. Delegates had arrived from the intelligence services of 6 nations: Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. Each nation was run by a military government. Each had its own networks of secret police, its own detention centres, its own lists of people it wanted found, and each had, independently, reached the same frustrating conclusion. Political dissidents did not stay in one country. They fled. They organised across borders. They gave interviews to foreign journalists from exile. They continued, in the language of these governments, to destabilise through the simple act of surviving and speaking. The solution, formalised on this November date, was called Operation Condor. The name was chosen deliberately. The Andean condor, a massive bird of prey, slow to rise but almost impossible to outrun once it locked onto its target. Patient, relentless, capable of travelling enormous distances without losing sight of what it was pursuing. The formal structure of Operation Condor was divided into 3 phases. Phase 1, intelligence sharing. Each member nation would share files on political targets, names, descriptions, known associates, last known locations, suspected activities. A central coordination centre was established under Chile's intelligence service, the Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, known by its initials as DINA. DINA was the nerve centre of Pinochet's domestic repression, and it now became the operational hub for a continental network. Phase 2. Cross-border operations. If a target was located in another Condor member state, the host nation would either carry out the detention itself or allow foreign agents to enter its territory and conduct the operation. This was a radical departure from conventional intelligence protocol. Sovereignty was, in effect, subordinated to the network. Phase 3, extended reach. Operations beyond South America, targets in Europe, targets in the United States. The Condor network would follow its prey wherever it went. What made Operation Condor so historically unusual was not simply its brutality. Brutal intelligence programs have existed in every era. What made it unusual was its architecture. It was not a single state committing atrocities. It was a multinational corporation of repression, with member nations, shared infrastructure, formal coordination meetings, and a communication system that connected 6 intelligence services into a single operational entity. It had, in other words, all the hallmarks of an institution. And institutions, as we will come to understand, are very difficult to kill. The Dina years, between 1975 and the late 1970s, Operation Condor was responsible for a staggering scale of human suffering that is still being fully documented to this day. The numbers, and I will not reduce human beings to statistics, but context requires some accounting, suggest that tens of thousands of people were killed across the participating nations during the broader period of military rule, with Condor operations specifically responsible for the cross-border targeting of hundreds of confirmed victims, and likely far more who were never officially recorded. What Condor added to this horror was the removal of sanctuary. Before Condor, a dissident who fled Chile for Argentina might survive. After Condor, they simply transferred into a different node of the same network. The Uruguayan Marxist Zelmar Michelini, for instance, was abducted in Buenos Aires and murdered. His death was facilitated by Uruguayan and Argentine intelligence operating jointly on Argentine soil. The Chilean exile community in Argentina was systematically infiltrated and targeted. The network functioned with chilling efficiency precisely because it was coordinated, not improvised, not reactive, but planned. There were code systems. There were prisoner transfer protocols. There were official communication channels using encrypted telexes. There were regular coordination meetings where member nations discussed ongoing operations with the same procedural formality as a corporate quarterly review. This was not a secret cabal meeting in darkened rooms. This was a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies generate paperwork. September 21st, 1976. Washington, D.C. The morning rush hour in Washington moved around Sheridan Circle without incident, as it always did. Sheridan Circle sits in the Embassy Row neighbourhood of the American capital, a quiet, leafy roundabout flanked by embassies, residences, and the kind of dignified architecture that signals old money and diplomatic immunity. At approximately 9:45 in the morning, a car passed through the circle. Orlando Letelier was inside it. Letelier was a former Chilean diplomat, the foreign minister under Salvador Allende, a man of considerable intellect and magnetic public presence who had become, in his exile in Washington, one of the most effective and internationally prominent voices against the Pinochet regime. He worked at the Institute for Policy Studies. He wrote, he gave speeches, he lobbied. He was to the Pinochet government, and by extension to Dina, precisely the kind of target that Operation Condor existed to eliminate. The car bomb detonated at 9:47. Orlando Letelier was killed instantly. His American colleague Ronnie Carpen Moffett also died. Her husband, Michael Moffett, who was also in the vehicle, survived. The assassination of Orlando Letelier on American soil was a turning point in the history of Operation Condor, not because it revealed the programme's existence, that was not yet publicly established, but because of what it demonstrated. Condor was not a regional programme. It was not limited to South American geography. It had reached into the capital city of the most powerful nation on earth and carried out a targeted assassination in broad daylight on an embassy-lined street. The United States government investigated. The investigation eventually pointed to Dina and to the direct authorization of Pinochet himself. The man who carried out the operation, Michael Townley, an American citizen who worked for Dina, eventually cooperated with American prosecutors and provided testimony that confirmed the reach, and operational sophistication of the Condor network. But Operation Condor itself remained for years only partially visible, suspected, discussed in intelligence circles, reported on in fragments by journalists, never confirmed in its full structural detail. Until a basement in Asunción, Paraguay changed everything. Section 2. The Archives of Terror. December 22, 1992. Asunción, Paraguay. Judge José Agustín Fernández was looking for something else entirely. He had received a tip, a routine tip, the kind that judges, in Paraguay were beginning to receive more frequently, as the long dictatorship of Alfredo Stroessner gave way, haltingly, to something more like democratic governance. The tip suggested that a cache of weapons might be stored in the offices of the local police in a neighbourhood of Asunción called Lambara. What Judge Fernandez found instead would take years to fully process and would ultimately reshape the historical understanding of state terrorism in the Southern Hemisphere. The archive was enormous. Researchers who later catalogued it described the collection as spanning approximately 8 tons of documents, hundreds of thousands of pages, files dating back decades, organised in the meticulous, self-serious manner of a bureaucratic apparatus that never imagined it would be exposed to public scrutiny. There were dossiers on individual political prisoners, detailed physical descriptions, records of interrogation sessions, notes on enhanced techniques applied, and in many cases, final disposition. The word disposed appeared frequently in the file summaries, and it did not mean what it means in ordinary administrative language. There were prisoner transfer records, documentation of individuals moved from one Condor nation to another, the logistics of moving human beings across international borders outside of any legal framework, handled with the same paperwork efficiency as a shipping manifest. There were the communication logs, telexes between intelligence services, encoded messages that, once decoded, revealed ongoing operational coordination between DINA in Chile, the Argentine Secretaría de Inteligencia del Estado, the Uruguayan Servicio de Información de Defensa, and their Paraguayan counterparts. These were not informal exchanges. They were institutional communications, filed and archived in the same manner as any other government correspondence. And there were the code systems, detailed documentation of the encryption protocols used between Condor member nations, the signal recognition procedures, the chain of command for authorizing cross-border operations. The archive became known, quickly and appropriately, as the Archives of Terror. International scholars, human rights organizations, legal teams representing survivors and families of the disappeared, all descended on Asunción to work through the material. The United States National Security Archive obtained copies of key documents and made them available. Governments across the region began, slowly and unevenly, to confront the documented reality of what their predecessors had constructed. The narrative that emerged from the Archives of Terror was, in its broad outlines, the narrative that entered the history books. Operation Condor had existed. It had been brutal. It had operated with multinational coordination, and it had, by the early 1980s, wound down as the military dictatorships of the Southern Cone gave way to civilian governments. This was the official conclusion, supported by the documents, accepted by most historians. But there was a researcher, a young archivist from Buenos Aires named Martin Rios, who spent 14 months working through the Paraguayan documents in the mid-1990s. He was methodical. He cross-referenced file numbers. He mapped communication chains. He built, on a large drafting table in a rented room in Asunción, a visual representation of the network as documented in the archives, and at some point in his 14th month of work he noticed something. Scattered across multiple documents, not concentrated in one file, not labelled or categorised, just appearing in the margins and footers of unrelated communications, the references to something called phase operational continuity. The phrase appeared at least 11 times across the archive, in documents spanning from 1979 to 1983. It appeared in the same kind of bureaucratic shorthand that was used for other standard Condor protocols. It was not explained, it was not elaborated upon. It appeared as though the writer expected the reader to already know what it referred to. Martin Rios flagged it. He included it in his research notes. He mentioned it to a colleague who was sceptical. He wrote a brief section about it in a draft paper that was never formally published, and then, like so many things that are noticed but not fully understood, it was set aside. For a while. The public conclusion versus the marginal note. When the archives of terror were processed and the major histories were written, the story of Operation Condor was framed as a closed chapter. The dictatorships had fallen. Democratic governments had taken their place. The network had dissolved because the political context that created it had dissolved. This is a reasonable argument. It is the argument that fits the evidence most neatly. But there is another argument, less comfortable, less tidy, and worth sitting within the dark for a moment. Institutions do not automatically dissolve when their stated purpose changes. The people who build institutions develop expertise, relationships, and professional identities that are not erased by political transitions. The infrastructure, the communication channels, the filing systems, the databases, the protocols, remains physically intact until someone deliberately dismantles it. And in the case of Operation Condor, there is no documented evidence of deliberate dismantlement. There is evidence of reduced activity. There is evidence of political transitions that change the stated priorities of member governments. There is an absence of evidence of continued operations, which is not the same thing as evidence of absence. The difference matters. And it mattered to a journalist in Buenos Aires, 19 years after the archives of terror were discovered, who came to the story not as a historian but as a reporter working an active beat. Section 3. Valentina Ruiz, Buenos Aires, present day. Valentina Ruiz had been covering the accountability beat for 8 years by the time she encountered the document that changed the direction of her work entirely. She was, in the parlance of Argentine journalism, a specialist in memoria, verdad, y justicia, memory, truth, and justice. She covered the ongoing trials of former military and intelligence officers. She wrote about the slow, grinding legal machinery, attempting to hold accountable people who had operated under the assumption that they never would be. She attended the hearings, she interviewed survivors, she read the documents. She was very good at reading documents. The document that changed things for her was not, on its face, remarkable. It was a 1984 intelligence memo, obtained through a Freedom of Information request she had filed as part of a broader investigation into the post-dictatorship transition period. The memo was from an Argentine intelligence official to an unnamed superior. It discussed, in the cautious, self-protective language of bureaucracies navigating political change, the question of what to do with existing operational structures in the new democratic environment. One paragraph near the bottom of the 3rd page read, "Regarding current cooperative frameworks, it is recommended that transition to civil-compatible operational models be completed prior to formal government handover. Strategic relationship continuity is assessed as essential to hemispheric security coordination." Valentina Ruiz read that paragraph several times. Transition to civil-compatible operational models. Not termination, not dismantlement, transition. The memo was not dated in the period of Operation Condor's peak activity. It was dated 1984, the period after Argentina's return to civilian rule, after the first democratic election since the coup. It was, in other words, a memo discussing what to do with intelligence infrastructure in a post-dictatorship political environment, and the recommendation it made was not to dismantle that infrastructure, it was to adapt it. The pattern, Valentina's training as an investigative journalist had given her a particular skill set, the ability to notice patterns in data that individually appeared unrelated. She called it constellation work, taking points of light that meant nothing in isolation and finding the shape they formed together. She began building a constellation. She started with disappearances, not the mass disappearances of the dictatorship era, which had been extensively documented and were now part of the official historical record. She was looking at something different. Individual cases, post-dictatorship cases, political organisers, labour activists, community leaders, and investigative journalists who had died or disappeared in the years between 1985 and the early 2000s. The cases shared certain characteristics that she documented carefully. The victims were not prominent national figures. They were mid-level organisers, people with significant reach within their communities, but not the kind of international profile that would generate major media attention when they disappeared. The incidents were not clustered. They were distributed over years and across multiple countries, which meant that no single investigative body ever looked at the full picture. Each disappearance was investigated, if at all, by the jurisdiction where it occurred. No one was comparing notes across borders. The methods were varied: road accidents, apparent suicides, sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths during detention. But the pattern of who was targeted showed a consistency that Valentina found difficult to attribute to coincidence. And the geography was striking. The disappearances she catalogued were disproportionately concentrated in the countries that had been Condor member states: Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. This proved nothing. These countries also happened to be among the most politically turbulent in the hemisphere during this period, with fraught transitions to democracy, significant social conflict, and persistent inequality driving political organisation. You could explain the pattern without invoking anything more sinister than the ordinary violence of political instability. But Valentina Ruiz was not a woman who stopped when she had one explanation. She kept pulling threads. The memo and the annexes over the following 18 months, Valentina built a case file that stretched across 4 filing cabinets and 2 external hard drives. She interviewed former intelligence officials, retired, disgruntled, or simply old enough to feel that the statute of limitations on their silence had expired. She filed freedom of information requests in 5 countries. She cultivated sources inside government ministries who had access to classified archives. The picture that emerged was fragmentary, incomplete, but it had a shape. She found evidence of intelligence cooperation agreements signed between former Condor nations in the 1980s and 90s, agreements framed as anti-drug or anti-terrorism frameworks but containing, in classified annexes that were not part of the publicly released versions, provisions that mirrored the Condor operational structure: real-time intelligence sharing, cross-border information exchange without judicial oversight, coordinated surveillance of named individuals classified as regional security concerns. The language of these annexes, Valentina noted, was strikingly similar to the language of the original 1975 Condor Agreement. Not identical, the framing had shifted from anti-communism to anti-drug trafficking and anti-terrorism, reflecting the post-Cold War political environment. But the structural logic was the same: member nations sharing intelligence on individuals considered threats, with provisions for coordinated action that operated outside normal legal channels. She also found something that she had not expected to find: personnel continuity. Several individuals who appeared in the Condor-era documents, mid-level intelligence analysts and coordination officers, not the senior figures who had been prosecuted, appeared again in the organisational charts of the post-transition intelligence services. They had not been purged, they had been retained. In some cases, they had been promoted. This was not, by itself, evidence of a continuing conspiracy. Intelligence services retain experienced personnel during transitions for practical reasons: institutional knowledge, technical expertise, operational continuity. The fact that someone worked in intelligence in 1978 and continued working in intelligence in 1992 did not make them a war criminal or a continuing operative of a secret network. But it did mean that the people who had built the Condor infrastructure were still present, still employed, still connected to each other and to the systems they had built. Institutions, Valentina kept reminding herself, are made of people, and people carry their knowledge, their relationships and their habits with them. Section 4. The source. The first contact came through a method that Valentina had used before with sources who were particularly cautious: an encrypted email service hosted on a server in Iceland, routed through a series of intermediary addresses that made the origin point effectively untraceable. The message was brief. It identified the sender only as someone who had worked in regional intelligence coordination during the 1980s and 90s. It said that they had followed her work for some time. It said that she was asking the right questions but looking in slightly the wrong direction. "You're treating Condor as ideology," the message. Read. It was never ideology, it was infrastructure. Valentina replied within the hour. Over the following 3 months, she exchanged more than 60 encrypted messages with the person she would come to call, in her notes, simply the coordinator. She never learned their real name. She never met them in person. She had no way to verify independently everything they told her, and she was careful to note in her records what she could corroborate with documentary evidence, and what remained, as she put it, source-dependent. But what the coordinator told her was consistent, internally coherent, and aligned in its broad outlines with the documentary evidence she had already assembled. This is what they said. What the coordinator said. Operation Condor was created with Cold War justification, anti-communism, anti-subversion, the language of the global ideological conflict. This was the public rationale, and to be honest, it was also the private rationale for most of the people involved. The people at the top of DINA, the people who signed the 1975 agreement, they believed genuinely that they were fighting a communist insurgency that threatened the stability of the hemisphere. But the infrastructure they built did not care about ideology. Infrastructure is neutral. A communication network is a communication network. A shared database of political targets is a shared database. The categories you use to define targets can be changed, but the database itself, the protocols, the relationships between the agencies, the chain of command, these are not ideological, they are operational. When the dictatorships began to fall, Chile transitioning to democracy, Argentina, Uruguay, the others, there were people within the intelligence services who faced a choice: dismantle everything, or adapt. Dismantlement is harder than it sounds. You don't just close down a network by signing a paper. You have to destroy the databases. You have to sever the relationships. You have to retrain the personnel or dismiss them entirely. You have to eliminate the institutional memory. This is politically difficult, practically challenging, and, crucially, it means giving up something that many people in these services considered genuinely valuable, regardless of how it had been used. The intelligence sharing network that Condor built was, from a purely technical standpoint, an extraordinary capability. 6 nations sharing real-time intelligence on individuals of interest, with coordinated response protocols. This was sophisticated by any standard. The fact that it had been used for purposes that were monstrous does not eliminate the fact that the underlying capability existed and could, in theory, be redirected. That is what some people chose to argue, that the capability could be retained and redirected, that the network did not need to be destroyed, it needed to be legitimized. What followed was not a formal decision made in a single meeting. It was more gradual than that, less organized. But the effect over time was the same. The Condor network did not dissolve, it decentralized. The formal structure disappeared. The coordination center at DINA was dismantled. The official Condor designation was dropped. The meetings became irregular and unofficial. But the relationships persisted. The personnel persisted. The databases were not destroyed. They were reclassified, moved, buried in archives that the new democratic governments did not know how to access, or did not fully understand what they were looking at. And gradually, the cooperation resumed, but under new frameworks: anti-drug coordination, anti-terrorism collaboration, regional security partnerships. Each of these had a legitimate surface, and most of the activity conducted under these labels was in fact legitimate. But within them, the older capability persisted. The ability to flag an individual across borders, the ability to coordinate action against a target without that target knowing they were being watched across multiple national jurisdictions simultaneously. The mission changed. In the Cold War, the targets were leftists, Marxists, Unionists, anyone considered a communist threat. After the Cold War, the mission became broader, harder to define. The language shifted to regional stability. Political organisers perceived as threatening to established economic or political interests. Journalists who were getting too close to sensitive topics. Activists coordinating multinational campaigns against governments or corporations. The methods changed too. No more mass disappearances. Those were too visible, too politically costly in the new democratic environment. The new methods were subtler. Financial investigations used to discredit, legal entrapment, engineering criminal charges to destroy credibility, digital surveillance that could be conducted without physical presence, character destruction campaigns, coordinated across media in multiple countries simultaneously, less visible, more deniable, exactly as effective. Section 5. The private sector. One of the structural challenges of maintaining a clandestine intelligence network across multiple countries in a democratic era is the problem of institutional cover. In a military dictatorship, intelligence services can operate with relative opacity. They answer to the military command, which answers to no one. In a democracy, intelligence services are nominally subject to legislative oversight, judicial review, and public accountability mechanisms. This creates a problem for anyone wishing to maintain an informal cross-border coordination network. Where do you put it? The answer, suggested by the coordinator and subsequently documented in part by Valentina's research, was the private sector. Between 1985 and 2000, a number of security consulting and risk management firms were established in major cities across the former Condor nations: Buenos Aires, Santiago, Montevideo, Asunción. Some had offices in Miami, Madrid and London as well. They advertised services in corporate security, political risk assessment, due diligence for international investment, and competitive intelligence. These were legitimate business categories. The corporate security industry was growing rapidly during this period as multinational corporations expanded into Latin American markets and sought to protect their interests in politically volatile environments. There was genuine demand for the services these firms advertised. But Valentina found something consistent across multiple firms she investigated. The senior personnel were former intelligence officials, not junior analysts, senior operational figures, people who had been, in some documented cases, present at Condor coordination meetings, people whose names appeared in the archives of terror in operational rather than merely administrative capacities. These individuals had, in the 1980s and 90s, transitioned from government intelligence work into the private sector. They had taken their expertise with them, and, crucially, they had taken their Rolodexes with them. Their contacts inside government intelligence services across the former Condor nations. The relationship between these private firms and the state intelligence services they were ostensibly separate from remained in many cases intimate. Former colleagues who had stayed in government referred clients to them. They were contracted to conduct investigations that government agencies, under democratic oversight, could not officially conduct. They shared intelligence with their government contacts. They existed in a permeable boundary between the official and unofficial, the public and private, the accountable and the deniable. This model, former government intelligence officials operating through private firms while maintaining relationships with active government services, was not unique to Latin America. It was a global pattern that had emerged in the post-Cold War period. But in the former Condor nations, Valentina argued, it had a specific history and a specific infrastructure to draw upon. The network had a container. It just wasn't a government building. The financial trail. Valentina spent 6 months attempting to document the personnel connections between the private security firms and the former Condor network. In Chile, a risk management firm founded in 1987 by 3 former DNA officers, all of whom appeared in the declassified Condor documents in operational roles, had worked, between 1990 and 2003, on at least 8 documented contracts with Chilean government ministries. One of these contracts involved personnel security assessments for an unnamed government program. The firm was dissolved in 2004. In Argentina, a political intelligence firm, founded in 1990, had counted among its clients 3 major multinational corporations operating in Argentina, as well as an association of landowners in political conflict with rural organizer movements throughout the 90s. The firm's founder had served as an intelligence analyst during the dictatorship period. In Uruguay, a security consulting firm had conducted regional threat assessments for a consortium of financial interests with stakes across 3 former Condor nations. The assessment included detailed dossiers on named labour organisers, journalists and political figures, material that, in format and methodology, was almost identical to the political intelligence dossiers in the archives of terror. None of this was proof of a continuing Condor network. Each piece of evidence could be explained in isolation. But Valentina was not arguing that any single piece of evidence proved her thesis. She was arguing that the pattern they formed together was worth taking seriously. Section 6. The United States Question. Any serious examination of Operation Condor must at some point address the question that has generated the most debate, the most scholarship, and the most sustained political controversy. What did the United States know, and what did it do? The documented history is this. The United States government, through the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department, was aware of Operation Condor during its operational period. The extent and nature of this awareness has been the subject of extensive scholarship and ongoing declassification efforts. Documents released through the efforts of researchers at the National Security Archive have established several important facts. American officials in the region were aware that Condor operations were taking place. Some State Department cables from the period show awareness of the network's existence in some of its operations. The question of active support, passive allowance, or simple awareness remains contested among historians. Some declassified documents suggest American officials provided operational advice or assistance. Others suggest that American policy was primarily passive, aware of Condor but not directing it. The most significant gap in the documentary record is that many of the most sensitive documents from this period remain classified or have been released in heavily redacted form. What is less disputed is the Cold War political context. American foreign policy in Latin America during this period was shaped overwhelmingly by anti-communism. The governments that formed the Condor network were American allies, supported with military assistance and diplomatic backing. The people Condor targeted were, from the American strategic perspective of the era, often on the wrong side of the Cold War. The Letelier assassination was the point at which this calculus became untenable. An assassination carried out on American soil by a foreign intelligence service was not something the American government could respond to with quiet acceptance. The FBI investigation and subsequent prosecution of Condor operatives involved in the Letelier bombing was genuine. The eventual finding of Dina's responsibility was officially acknowledged, but the prosecution of the Letelier case was also, in a sense, carefully bounded. It targeted the specific operation and the specific perpetrators. It did not become a broader investigation of the Condor network as a whole, its American dimensions, or the extent of American awareness of its operations more generally. The 1990s, cables. Among the documents that Valentina obtained through her Freedom of Information research was a set of United States State Department cables from the early 1990s. Several of these cables discussed, in the careful language of diplomatic correspondence, the question of regional security cooperation in the post-Cold War environment. One cable from 1991 referenced the importance of maintaining what it called hemispheric coordination mechanisms in the new political environment. The phrase caught Valentina's attention because of its echo of Cold War language. Hemispheric coordination had been a consistent theme of American Cold War policy in Latin America. The idea that the United States and its regional allies needed to coordinate their security postures against common threats. Operation Condor had been, in some analytical framings, an expression of that same logic. The 1991 cable did not mention Condor. It discussed the general question of regional security architecture in the post-Cold War period and recommended maintaining robust intelligence sharing relationships between American allies in the hemisphere. Was this evidence of American involvement in a continuing Condor-like network? No, it was evidence of ordinary diplomatic planning. But read alongside the other evidence Valentina had assembled, the classified annexes, the personnel continuity, the private security firms. It contributed to a picture in which the impulse toward regional intelligence coordination had not ended with the Cold War, but had merely been reframed. Section 7, the whistleblower. 9 months into her investigation, Valentina received a second contact. This one was different from the coordinator, more agitated, less measured, with the particular quality of urgency that she had learned, over years of journalism to associate with someone who had decided to take a risk they were afraid of. The contact identified themselves as a former analyst in the Uruguayan intelligence service. They had left the service, they said, under circumstances they did not want to elaborate on. They said they had information about a specific case. The case involved a man, the whistleblower used no name, referred to him only as the organiser, who had been coordinating a multinational, anti-corruption campaign in the mid-2000s. The campaign was focused on a network of financial relationships between regional governments and a series of multinational extractive companies. It had been gaining traction. It had attracted supporters and attention across 5 countries. It had apparently attracted other kinds of attention as well. The organiser had died in a car accident on a mountain road in 2006. The local investigation had found no evidence of foul play. The case was closed within 3 months. The whistleblower said they had seen, during their time in the intelligence service, an internal communication that referenced the organiser's death. The communication had used the phrase neutralisation under cooperative authority. Valentina felt the hair on her arm stand up when she read that phrase. Neutralisation was standard Condor-era language. It appeared in the archives of terror repeatedly. It referred to the elimination of targets, sometimes through detention, sometimes through assassination. Cooperative authority was a phrase from the formal Condor structure, referencing the joint authorization mechanism that allowed cross-border operations to proceed with the formal concurrence of member nations. The phrase neutralization under cooperative authority combined 2 pieces of Condor-specific operational terminology in a single phrase, used in an internal communication from the 2000s, 30 years after the formal creation of Operation Condor. Valentina could not verify the whistleblower's claim. She had no access to the internal communication they described. She included the account in her investigation file with clear notation of its unverified status. But it stayed with her, because if the phrase had been used, even once, even in passing, it suggested something about the culture and the self-understanding of whoever had used it. It suggested that they thought of themselves as operating within a framework that had a specific historical lineage, that they understood what they were doing as continuous with what had come before. Networks, Valentina wrote in her notes, don't just share databases, they share language, and language carries history. Section 8. The infrastructure was always the point. Valentina had been working as a journalist for long enough to know that the story she was building was not a story she could fully prove. It was a story she could document to a certain level of evidentiary certainty, and then it became, as all the best investigative stories eventually do, a matter of interpretation. The facts she could establish. 1. Operation Condor was formally created on November 25, 1975, and operated as a documented multinational intelligence coordination program through at least the early 1980s. 2. The Archives of Terror, discovered in 1992, confirm the operational structure of Condor in extensive detail, including evidence of ongoing coordination through at least 1983. 3. Intelligence cooperation agreements between former Condor nations in the 1980s and 90s contained classified annexes with structural provisions similar to the Condor framework, reframed under anti-drug and anti-terrorism language. 4. Former Condor-era intelligence officials transitioned into the private security sector in the 1980s and 90s, maintaining contact with active government intelligence services in former Condor nations. 5. A pattern of targeted disappearances and deaths affecting political organisers, journalists and activists in former Condor nations continued in the post-dictatorship period, with characteristics consistent with a continuing sophisticated network rather than ordinary political violence. 6. Internal communications using Condor-era operational language had allegedly been observed in intelligence service, communications as recently as the mid-2000s, though this could not be independently verified. What she could not establish, a formal organisational entity calling itself Phase 2 of Operation Condor, with a chain of command, official membership and documented operational decisions. What the coordinator had told her and what she had come to believe based on everything she had found, was that the absence of a formal entity was itself part of the design. The Condor Continuity Directive. In the final weeks of her investigation, Valentina received one more communication from the coordinator. It came not through the encrypted email service, but through a different channel. A physical envelope, postmarked from a city in Spain, containing a single printed page. The page purported to be a scan of a document dated 1989. The header read, Condor Continuity Directive. The text was brief, and the scan was of poor quality, blurred in places with what appeared to be fold marks obscuring several lines. But one section was legible. It read, Political transitions do not dissolve strategic cooperation. Network integrity is maintained through decentralized coordination. All member services are advised to transition operational relationships to civil-compatible frameworks. Continuity of database access and communication protocols is assessed as essential. This directive supersedes all previous termination orders. Valentina stared at the page for a long time. She could not authenticate it. She had no original document to compare it to, no way to verify the provenance of the scan, no chain of custody for the physical page. The coordinator had sent it without explanation, in a way that made it impossible to use as primary evidence in any published piece. She did not know if it was real, but she also did not know it wasn't real. And sitting with that uncertainty, with the specific, irreducible uncertainty of a document that could not be verified but are hidden. They are the ones that cannot are hidden. They are the ones that cannot be confirmed or denied. The ones that exist in the space between what can be documented and what can only be suspected. Operation Condor had been exposed. Its horrors were on record. The survivors had spoken. The judges had ruled. The history books had been written. But the question of what the network became after the history books said it was over, that question remained, as the phrase in the Paraguayan archive had suggested 40 years ago, in the space of pending. Section 9. What networks become? Step back from the specifics of Operation Condor for a moment and consider the broader question that this story raises, a question that is not unique to Latin America, not unique to the Cold War, and not unique to the 1970s. What happens to intelligence infrastructure after? The political context that created it changes. History offers examples in both directions. There are cases where intelligence programs have been genuinely dismantled, the files destroyed, the personnel redeployed or dismissed, the networks severed. This has happened. It requires sustained political will, institutional leadership willing to absorb the short-term costs of capability reduction, and oversight mechanisms that are both empowered and functioning. And there are cases where intelligence infrastructure has been adapted, reoriented and perpetuated under changed conditions. This has also happened. It is perhaps more common because the incentives for perpetuation are generally stronger than the incentives for dismantlement. People who have built something tend to believe it is valuable. Capabilities tend to be retained because the argument for retention, we might need this, is always available, and the argument for dismantlement requires a specificity of political conviction that is not always present. Operation Condor was an extreme case. The atrocities committed under its banner were severe enough that there should have been, in principle, strong political and moral incentives to ensure that not just the program, but its underlying infrastructure was eliminated. The new democratic governments of the Southern Cone had every political reason to demonstrate a clean break. Whether that clean break was actually made, whether the infrastructure was genuinely dismantled or merely repackaged, is the question at the centre of Valentina Ruiz's investigation. And it is a question that remains, in the strictest documentary sense, unanswered. The contemporary surveillance dimension. We live in an era of unprecedented digital surveillance capability. The technical tools available to state intelligence services and to the private security firms that operate in their orbit have expanded in scope and sophistication to a degree that would have been unimaginable in 1975. The ability to monitor communications, track location data, map social networks, and build detailed profiles of individuals of interest no longer requires physical surveillance or human informants. It can be done remotely, continuously, and at scale. The cross-border intelligence coordination that Condor achieved through encrypted telexes and physical coordination meetings can now be accomplished through real-time data sharing between national agencies or contracted to private data analytics firms that operate across jurisdictions simultaneously. This means that the capability gap between what Operation Condor represented in 1975 and what a modern equivalent would represent is vast. A contemporary version of the network that Condor built would be exponentially more powerful, more pervasive, and more difficult to detect. It would also, in many ways, be more deniable, because the same digital infrastructure used for legitimate intelligence work, counter-terrorism, organised crime investigations, cybersecurity, can be used for other purposes, and the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate use may not be visible from the outside. Section 10. Publication and response. Valentina published her investigation in 3 parts, across a period of 6 weeks, in a major Argentine investigative outlet. The first part documented the historical record of Operation Condor, drawing on the archives of terror and the established scholarly literature, but adding new documentary evidence about the phase operational continuity references that had first been noticed by Martin Rios 20 years earlier. The second part documented the post-dictatorship period, the intelligence cooperation agreements with their classified annexes, the personnel continuity, the private security firms, the pattern of targeted disappearances. The third part presented the testimony of the coordinator and the Uruguayan whistleblower, clearly framed as unverified source accounts, alongside the Condor Continuity Directive, presented with full disclosure of its unverifiable provenance. The response was significant and predictable in its contours. Governments in the former Condor nations issued statements denying any continuation of Condor-like activities. The denials were categorical and official. Several governments pointed to their formal accountability processes, the truth commissions, the prosecutions of former officials, the compensation programs for survivors, as evidence of their break with the Condor past. Within the intelligence and security communities, the reaction was quieter and more mixed. Several former officials contacted Valentina off the record to dispute specific factual claims. 2 contacted her to provide additional information, though neither was willing to be identified. The academic response was cautious and appropriately scholarly. Historians who had written extensively on Operation Condor praised the documentary research while expressing appropriate skepticism about the unverified dimensions of the investigation. The coordinator sent one final message after the publication. It read simply, "Now you understand why we said what we said in 1989. Political transitions do not dissolve strategic cooperation." Nothing more. Closing. The thing about networks. There is a particular quality to the room right now, wherever you are listening to this. The particular weight of a story that doesn't resolve the way you might want it to. I've told you about a conspiracy, but I've also told you honestly that the conspiracy cannot be fully proven. I've shown you the documentary evidence that exists. I've shown you the gaps in that evidence. I've given you the sources and told you clearly which claims can be verified and which cannot. And I've left you, as Valentina Ruiz was left, in the space of uncertainty. That is not an attempt to avoid accountability for what I've presented. The historical facts are documented. The pattern of evidence is real. The question of interpretation, what that pattern means, whether it constitutes a continuing program or the ordinary residue of history, is genuinely open. But there is something I want to say about networks, and about history, and about the particular difficulty of understanding when something ends. We are very good, as humans, at thinking about beginnings. We mark them with dates and ceremonies and formal announcements. November 25th, 1975. The meeting in Santiago. The signing of the agreement. The formal establishment of an institution. We are less good at thinking about endings. Endings are often unclear. They happen gradually, incompletely, with residues and holdovers that persist long after the formal moment of termination. We want endings to be clean. We want to say the dictatorship fell on this date and everything that the dictatorship represented ended on this date. But the actual experience of history rarely cooperates with that desire for clarity. Operation Condor as a formal program with that name and that structure did end. The documentation supports this. But the relationships it created, the infrastructure it built, the personnel it trained, the databases it compiled, these did not have an ending date stamped on them. They existed in the world. They continued to exist after the program's formal termination. What happened to them after that point is a question that the evidence illuminates but does not fully answer. And that, I think, is what makes this story what it is. Not a story about a conspiracy that can be definitively proven. Not a story about a conspiracy that can be definitively disproven. A story about the specific texture of institutional persistence, the way that things that are built tend to continue, the way that relationships that are formed tend to survive political transitions, the way that capabilities that are developed tend to find new uses. The most effective operations are the ones history believes are over. Whether Operation Condor falls into that category, whether the network that was built in Santiago in 1975 is, in some form and under some name, still operational today, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that the question deserves to be asked, that the people who were targeted by Operation Condor, and the people who were targeted by whatever came after it, and the people who might be targeted by whatever comes after that, they deserve to have someone asking the question on their behalf. Valentina Ruiz asked it. Martin Rios noticed something that others overlooked. The people whose names are in the archives of terror lived it. You, listening in the dark, are now part of the chain of people who know enough to keep asking. Sleep well, but not too peacefully.